Hello and welcome to Sensitive Changemakers, the podcast where we celebrate the power of sensitivity and introversion in leadership, entrepreneurship and beyond. I'm Kate Carter, your host, a certified professional coach, HSP and introvert who's passionate about helping you embrace your unique gifts and lead with authenticity. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to Sensitive Changemakers. I am always incredibly honoured to have guest speakers on our podcast, and this one is absolutely no exception. I'm very excited about the book that we're going to be talking about as well, which huge kind of sneak preview into what we're going to be talking about today. But Rachel Radway is a certified leadership coach, mentor, speaker and author with 25 plus years experience in corporate leadership roles across a range of industries. Rachel helps high achieving, highly perceptive and neurodivergent clients learn to lead with confidence, clarity and authenticity and without burning out. And her book, Perceptive, has launched. Rachel, I'm so honoured and happy to have you with us. Is there anything you would like to add to that bio?
Oh, that is a fantastic way to be introduced. So thank you, Kate. I'm so excited to be here and to talk with you today.
Yay! And I love the fact that we have an author on here because I think I've said this to Rachel before. I think it's a wonderful way for highly sensitives to express themselves. And I think sometimes, especially in the online space, it gets forgotten as a way to share our thoughts and our expertise. So I'm very, very excited to delve into this with you. So first of all, I know you've had quite the journey and you've lived in lots of different places. Would you like to kind of just give us, a deep dive? I know I say to a lot of people a brief overview, but that's absolutely fine if it's a deep dive into how you got to where you are today.
Sure. I would love to. Thank you. So it has definitely been a very, very twisty, windy path. And the more I talk with highly sensitive leaders, especially, and highly perceptive leaders, the more I learn that a lot of us have similarly windy, twisty paths. And I think there are reasons for that in the way that we're wired. I started out long, long ago in writing and editing and moved into, so I was in the corporate world, as you said in your introduction, and I moved into internal communications, employee communications, which I love doing. And I also did stints in brand management and in design operations and in a number of other, I think, related fields.
Mm-hmm.
I also, as you mentioned, have lived in a lot of different places. I love learning about other cultures and other languages. And so I have lived in 8 countries outside of the United States, and I have studied 9 languages, although don't ask me to speak any of them. Um, I'm really, really good at them when I am immersed in them, and I can get not fluent, but very conversant very quickly, and then I move on to the next one, and
Yes,
I lose the last one. So I can make a lot of hybrid sentences. With a lot
I'm
of
with you on
different.
that one.
It's fun. It's
It
not
is.
very understandable, but I have moved around quite a lot. And I have also, one of the things that I talk to a lot of my clients about is I am a multi-potentialite. And many people are not familiar with that word, but it came out in a TEDx talk, I think in 2011 or 12, maybe. The concept is that we are often good at a lot of different things and we are interested in a lot of different things. And especially those who are wired a little differently, and HSPs fall into this category, we tend to get bored just doing one thing for a long period of time.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily a societally accepted way to have a career.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I talk with a lot of my clients about is it is absolutely fine and acceptable, and we need to do what works for us, not what society has deemed acceptable in air quotes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a briefish history of my background. I ended up so I was in the tech world for a lot of my corporate career, and I ended up getting laid off for, I think, a reduction in force for the eighth or ninth time, possibly a few years ago. And I decided to do something at that point that I had wanted to do for many, many years, which was to get formally trained and certified as a leadership coach. So I had coached before, I had worked for a lot of senior leaders and executives, and I had coached them and I had coached some of my peers, but I really wanted to get formal training and learn more about it. And so I did that after that layoff. And I had planned to sort of start building my coaching business on the side while I was still working. As it
Mhm.
turned out, the while I was still working part, because I did get another contract job, but that job only lasted a year. And then the landscape being what it is right
Mhm.
now in the tech world and in the United States, I'm not sure what it's like where you are. It just became impossible to find something else. And it was time. It was beyond time for me to go out on my own. So super excited. I've been working with amazing clients. And for the past year, I've been working on the book, Perceptive. So that brings us to where we are now.
Yes. And I love the fact that you're talking about languages and different cultures. And my geeky brain is like, oh, I'd love to do a study to see if that is a common theme through highly sensitives because I've always loved learning about different cultures. It's from a young age. And I wasn't naturally gifted with languages either. It's not something that came easy. It's just something I loved. I loved going over there and being able to like explore. And so when you were saying that, I was like, oh, I would love to know whether that's a common theme throughout highly sensitives.
I can tell you, so one of the most interesting jobs that I've ever had was when I was right out of school. I worked for a nonprofit organization called the Johnson O'Connor Research Foundation. They have several offices throughout the United States, and they research innate abilities.
Mm.
And in my training and in my work there, I ended up studying all of the different traits that they study. And they get, at least at the time when I was there, which was, many years ago, um, they gave something like 32 or 35 tests and that they had developed. So they were not the kinds of tests that you get in school. They were
Mhm.
testing things that you never would have thought about doing, which is how that they know that they're innate. And we put together profiles based on people's abilities. And it wasn't about what are you good at, what are you bad at. It was about the premise was that you are more fulfilled when you are doing the things that you are naturally good at, which is logical. One of the things that we talked a lot about was the different traits that add up to language abilities. I don't know that those are inherent among highly sensitive people. What does strike me as inherent is a natural curiosity
Mhm.
and an interest in other cultures and other people and the way other people live and other parts of the world. And I think for those who have that curiosity, and especially those who have all of the traits involved in languages,
Mm.
it's a very, very natural pursuit. I think even if you don't necessarily have if you're not naturally a language learner, the curiosity about the people and the places and the cultures seems to be something that I've seen just across the board.
Mhm.
So it makes a
Oh,
lot of sense.
that's so interesting. And I'm just stubborn, so I just didn't give up until I got there.
I'm with you.
I would love to know your book, Perceptive. How did you come up with the idea? Like, where, yeah, where has it come from? What kind of ideas are you bringing together in this?
So it really comes from the conversations that I have had, particularly with women, because my business focuses mostly on women. I work primarily with women clients, but with leaders who are highly sensitive, whether or not they were familiar with that term or identified with it before we had a conversation about it.
Mhm.
So when I first started my coaching work, I knew that I wanted to work with women leaders. I didn't know anything beyond that. I didn't have any specific niche determined. What I found very quickly was that the people who were drawn to me and the people that I most enjoyed working with all, I think without exception, turned out to be highly sensitive.
Mm.
And I'm not sure any of them actually had heard the term or knew Elaine Aron's book before we talked. But the more we talked, the more I saw the common threads and understood that they were either emotionally sensitive and or sensitive to energies and or had sensory sensitivities or all of the above. They just thought that they were alone, that they were unique in this. And so many of them had grown up with messages that they were too much,
Mm-hmm.
or they were not enough, or they were broken, or they were crazy, or they did things the wrong way.
Mm.
And those messages often, but not always, had continued on into adulthood and in their work. And so they very often felt that they were alone. And particularly since leadership coaching is my area, they felt that they were alone in the workplace.
Mm.
And there are so many ways that this trait of what I call high sensory perception, or people who are highly perceptive, there are so many ways that this comes out in the workplace, both in terms of challenges and in terms of strengths and assets. And I found that especially the people who had grown up with these negative messages tended to focus more on the challenges and not necessarily recognize that their gifts were actually gifts. They tended to think that the things they were good at were things everybody was good at,
Yes.
when that is so not true. And there are leadership assets and superpowers that people who are more perceptive have that make them incredible leaders and that engender loyalty among their teams. And I really wanted to get this word out beyond the people that I have the capacity to work with one on one. And especially since literally was having the same conversations day after day and week after week with these brilliant people
Mm.
who had just grown up being told that there was something wrong with them. And I'm super passionate about trying to raise awareness about, first of all, the fact that there is nothing wrong with them, that they have gifts,
Mm-hmm.
that embracing these gifts can actually help deal with the challenges a little bit more effectively, and that this is really part of what neurodiversity is. That's a word that is intimidating for a lot of people, but our brains are wired a little differently. By our, I mean people who are more sensitive. Neurodivergent just means we don't have typical brains or nervous systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I differ with the word typical because I don't really know what that means. I'm not sure there is a typical brain, and
Absolutely.
I think we're learning a lot more about this. But that's really where the book came from.
I love that. And I just wanted to pull up a few things there. I think the language around highly sensitive, even if people don't identify or don't know about the term highly sensitive, they still have a story about something in their past that was deemed as wrong. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does make sense. And it's interesting because, so in the book, I interviewed 16 different women leaders, different backgrounds, different areas of leadership, different demographics, different ages, different age ranges. And a few of them hadn't identified as sensitive themselves
Mm.
before. So I mentioned that most of the women that I talked to aren't familiar with the term HSP, but they do have something in their background, as you just said, where they were, for example, I'll use myself. So I've always been incredibly sensitive to sound. And even as a child, I remember being told, you need to get over it. You can't have things the way that you want it. Not everybody's going to be quiet for you. You're too sensitive. And
Mm-hmm.
that also came out in other ways because I am sensitive across the board. So different environmental stimuli, also emotions, also energies,
Mm-hmm.
really foods and caffeine and anything you can be
Yes.
sensitive to, pretty much
Yes.
I am. There are leaders whom I've spoken with who are sensitive to a few of those things, but very strongly. And so didn't identify as sensitive because that word has a stigma
Mm-hmm.
associated with it, especially for people who are very smart and high
Yes.
achievers and sensitivity, especially in the modern workplace in the Western world, is thought of as a weakness and not as a strength.
Mhm.
However, wrongly, that is the connotation that a lot of people have around it. So these leaders didn't necessarily want to be thought of as sensitive in any way, shape, or form. And yet, I have stories about um, how they were affected as children, even in ways where their uh, people surrounding them told them that they needed to tough it up and they
Mhm.
needed to, get a thicker skin, the same messages that I received.
Yes. Yes, I think a lot of probably people listening to this can relate to being told in different ways to thicken up, to man up is a word that I know is completely not acceptable in lots of different ways, but it was definitely one that was around in the 80s as I was growing up. It
Hmm.
was that very much that terminology.
Yeah.
And I think going back to what you were saying there about the weakness, about the language around the word sensitive, and also all of the nuance that's included with the words being sensitive, what that means. Like you said, sensitivity to sound, to touch, to taste. And that's all external, let alone the internal in terms of emotion and thought processing and all of those kind of different things as well. I'm really intrigued to hear, as you were having these interviews with women, were there any patterns in terms of their own their own perceptions around what they considered a weakness? Does that make sense?
It does. I think there definitely were patterns, and I'm trying to think of some of the ones that were the most common. Certainly for those who had sensory sensitivities,
Mm.
that was an issue. And if you think about the number of open plan offices, especially since, I come from the tech world, as I mentioned, and several of my clients do too, although not all of them, and several of the women that I interviewed did as well. And even not in the tech world, this is becoming more prevalent or had been more prevalent over the last, 20 years or so. The open plan office, where you A, have no privacy, but B, are constantly exposed to all of the noises that are going
Mhm.
on in your whole office environment and smells. I mean, the stories I
Mhm.
remember being seated a little bit too close to a kitchen where people were microwaving lunches and there were fish smells coming out and all kinds of,
Mhm.
we had a very global team and there were people making Indian food and Japanese food and Chinese food and all of the combined smells. It's not that I don't like them, it's that I can't, it's overwhelming,
Mhm.
right? There are, one of the women in the book talks about lighting and the really harsh artificial lighting.
Yes.
And another one was air conditioning and fans when they're blowing right on
Mhm.
you and you have no control over where you're sitting or where the air is coming from. Um, there are so many different physical factors that can weigh in. And then there's the emotional. So one of the patterns that came up emotionally is receiving feedback. We tend to, so there is actually a trait called rejection sensory sensitivity dysphoria, RSD, that is very, very, very common among people with ADHD. And one of the things that I've learned in my research is there is a huge overlap between ADHD and highly sensitive people,
Mhm.
even if they never showed any, and again, I'm going to do the air quotes around the word typical
Mhm.
traits for what we used to think of as ADHD. But rejection sensory sensitivity dysphoria makes us super sensitive to anything that is taken internally as criticism.
Mhm.
And in a lot of workplaces, that is the culture, right? It's feedback is supposed to be a gift. And so
Mhm.
we're supposed to be able to take it without taking it personally, and we're supposed to use it to develop, right, for our professional growth and personal growth. It is exceptionally hard for a lot of highly sensitive people to receive feedback, not only to receive it, sometimes to give it. And this came up in a lot of my interviews as well, because these women leaders are so sensitive to, they're so empathetic to their direct reports or their colleagues that they understand how their colleagues or direct reports feel when they receive feedback. And that makes it more difficult for them to deliver the feedback in the first place.
I can so relate
So,
to that.
I, yes, I mean it's a thing, right? And
Mhm.
that came up with a lot of the women I talked to.
So, so interesting. Yes, I can completely relate.
I think one of the things that I wanted to do with the book, though, was rather than focusing on the weaknesses, because that's what the world focuses on, to focus on the strengths that, as I mentioned earlier, not everyone actually recognized in themselves as strengths and
Hmm.
gifts. And that was another area where I saw a lot of patterns among the women in the book. So, one example, and this is something that can show up as a challenge, but once you understand where it's coming from and the gifts that surround it, I'm gonna back up on myself for a second and talk about one of the things that I talk about in the book is the challenges and the strengths I see as two sides of the same coin.
Hmm.
They each trait has something that could be seen as negative and something that could be seen as positive.
Yes.
And the trick is to look at the positives. And it's not, I don't do it in terms of toxic positivity. It's not denying the negatives in any way, because I've certainly experienced all the challenges over my whole career. But it's really embracing the parts that, because we tend to be so critical of ourselves and of others and have such high standards and expectations, we don't embrace or leverage the gifts. And so that's really what I wanted to focus on and bring those more to light. And I can give one example that was true for just about every single person that I talked with. One of the things about highly sensitive brains is that we have fewer filters on incoming information than brains that are not as highly sensitive. So there's a data point, and I may get this wrong, but that the typical, again, in air quotes, brain subconsciously processes something like,
Mm.
I think, 10 or 11 million pieces of information per second.
I
It's
think
some
it is a
crazy.
ridiculous amount of, yeah,
Yeah.
I did do that in my training. I can't remember it now, but yes, it is a ridiculous
Exactly.
amount.
I forgot I'm not a numbers person, but some insanely huge number of pieces of information per second. We only consciously process of those millions or billions or whatever it is, 40 to 50, I believe, is the number. That changes when we're talking about highly sensitive brains. And there's a great book called The Brain of the Highly Sensitive Person that talks about how our brains are different. The author is Esther Bergsma. She's a Dutch author and expert on high sensitivity. And so we are filtering out fewer of those millions and millions of pieces of information, which means we're processing more.
Hmm.
Not always consciously, right? We're not aware of all of this stuff. But this gives us superpowers. We are making connections that other people are not making. We're connecting dots, we're connecting data points. We are doing strategic thinking. We are jumping several steps
Hmm.
ahead, which is a gift in so many ways, in so many different circumstances. It can also be a challenge. And this is something that when I relate my story to women leaders, I hear a lot of, oh, yes, that has happened to me so many times. So several years ago, I got what's called a 360 feedback review. I don't know
Yes,
whether
I've
that's
done those myself. Yes.
there you go. So where just for any listeners who might not be familiar, it's when your boss collects feedback from peers and direct reports and people above you, and it's all put together into a report. And I was told that people perceived me as stomping on their ideas, and therefore they didn't see me as a team player. And that feedback, going back to the RSD we were talking about, that crushed me
Yeah.
because it was the furthest thing from my intention. I was actually a senior manager supporting team operations, and my whole goal was to make the team feel supported and engaged and to do everything I could to make it a highly enjoyed place to be.
Hmm.
In fact, our numbers were great. We had in 2021, which was the height of the Great Resignation,
Hmm.
we had 0% attrition on my team. So the
Wow.
feedback I was getting didn't seem to
Mm.
sync with the numbers, but the feedback was feedback from other people. So I couldn't just ignore
Yeah.
it. What I learned in the last few years in all of the research I've been doing is that A, the brains of highly sensitive people, we tend to optimize for successful group outcomes rather than for individual outcomes. And if you have done any intercultural studies, this is really fascinating because the United States is not known um, for group thinking or group collaboration.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
much more individually focused.
Hmm.
And people see their work as being competitive versus
Yes.
collaborative. So that's one piece of it that differentiates our brains. Then you put that together with what I was saying before about how much more of the information we are processing and how our brains are quickly
Hmm.
and subconsciously making these connections. And I realized what was happening. So when somebody came up with an idea for the team, that I could see wouldn't work because my brain was jumping several steps ahead and understanding the ramifications of all of
Hmm.
these different steps. And it could see, okay, this is not going to work for X reason. Because I was jumping several steps ahead, it didn't occur to me that other people weren't necessarily,
Hmm.
and that I wasn't actually communicating all of those steps. I was just skipping them because it made complete sense to me. So in uh, my eagerness to get the team to the next place so that we could be successful, I was just skipping ahead. And
Hmm.
in doing that, I was leaving other people behind. And they felt very obviously that I was stomping on their ideas. So I totally understood what was happening. I felt terrible about it. Knowing that can change has changed the way that I communicate and the way that I um, it- participate in brainstorming activities, for
Hmm.
example, and means that I can yes and ideas and encourage things that take from the idea that someone generated and add something to
Yeah.
it, or maybe nudge it in a different direction, or maybe just shut up for a few minutes while the brainstorming is happening.
Yeah.
And then when we start to narrow down ideas, then I can chime in.
Hmm.
But that's an example that has resonated with a lot of the leaders that
Yes.
I've talked with.
Yes. And I think even on a more simplistic level for me is, and I've had to really practice this skill, is my brain, because it goes so quick, my mouth doesn't keep up with my brain. So sometimes that just means that I won't finish a sentence because by the time I've spoken that sentence, my brain has already gone to the next sentence and wants to hop ahead. But on another one, I have this weird, peculiar habit of swapping the first letters of words over when I'm
Hmm.
speaking really quickly. So
Hmm.
I wanted to kind of add that in there because as you were talking, I was like, yes, in a workplace, absolutely it works. But I think just on an individual day to day level for a highly sensitive, I think it can come up in loads of wonderful different ways that you may not even experience or expect. But yes, I love that. I absolutely do. And what just to keep going with the strengths, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying. Everything is, I like to think of everything as a scale. You know, you've
Hmm.
got a particular trait and it can go all the way down to this kind of polarization here or all the way over to the other. And
Hmm.
it's all dependent on what you're bringing to that trait, your perception of that trait, all of those different things. But I'd
Hmm.
love to know what you see as or what you've seen as some of the strengths that actually highly sensitives have. I know for me, one of mine was listening, which I thought I was rubbish at. But actually, doing the work that I do now, I've realized that actually I've got better, even better at it, but it was always something I was very good at because it was just innate and something that I just normalized and didn't even see it as a strength.
And I would suggest that there might be an underlying skill that's related to your listening, which is empathy. So empathy is something that everyone has. What I have found is that highly sensitive people, highly perceptive people tend to have it in enormous amounts. We tend to have more empathy than other people have. It tends to be a muscle that we're more used to flexing. Not always for ourselves. We
Yes.
can be harder on ourselves than a lot of other people are. We can be lacking in self-compassion and
Mhm.
self-empathy, but we tend to have it in spades for other people. And I think when you have empathy for another person, it helps to listen to what they're saying because, again, you have that. Well, and maybe that's a couple of different things. So, in addition to empathy, I would say that a love of learning and a lifelong curiosity are traits that I have found very, very, very common in this group. And when you put all of those together, listening makes complete sense because you want to learn about the other person. You want to understand what's going on. You want to be able to empathize with them and put yourself in their shoes. And the only way we can do that is by listening.
Mm.
So it's interesting because there are, from coach training, you probably know there are different levels of listening, and we talk about deep listening and active listening and how those things can show up. At the same time, there are um, there are a couple of traits that I find with highly sensitive people and highly perceptive people that um, that may, how do I say this? I don't want to say get in the way of listening because it doesn't, but affect their communication styles.
Mm.
So one thing that happens is I mentioned before that there was a large overlap between ADHD and highly sensitive people.
Mhm.
People with ADHD tend to interrupt a lot. Not always, but it is a fairly common trait. As soon as we recognize that we're doing that, we usually feel terrible about it
Mhm.
and are often able to train ourselves not to do it. But the other things that comes up with highly perceptive folks is they tend to fall into one of two camps in terms of communication. They either talk a huge amount and want to give a lot of context and a lot of detail and don't know when to stop, or they're so attuned to the group dynamics and what's going on and who's listened to and who's not. And they're afraid of being perceived as just speaking up to be heard, just for the sake of being heard, that they don't speak up enough.
Mhm.
And so their point of view isn't heard enough or shared enough. Um,
It's so interesting.
it's a fascinating area. It doesn't, so it's a little bit, it's connected to what you were talking about with listening, but um, I sort of look at it as all of communication and the different traits that are
Yeah,
associated with that.
absolutely. And I think it's, again, just trying to think of it in practical terms. I wonder if there's an element as well of, as somebody who's highly perceptive, being able to pick up on visual cues from other people when you're speaking to them. I know I've done this myself, where you think, oh my God, they're not listening. I need to speed up or I need to get through this quicker. And I just wonder again if that's just something that's normal for me and other highly sensitives and isn't necessarily something that's in somebody else's. I just wonder if you've ever experienced or whether that fits into what you were talking here as well.
It absolutely does. So that is a trait that was pretty much universal across all of the women I interviewed for the book and all of my clients. One of the traits that we have, and I think this is connected to a number of the different traits that we've talked about before, the empathy and the natural curiosity
Mm.
and the downloading the information quickly and a word that I haven't used yet, but intuition. We tend to be very
Mm.
deeply intuitive. So one of the things that is true for all of these leaders is they tend to be very good at reading individual people and reading the room.
Mm.
And as you said, it's visual signals, it's facial expressions, it's energy, it
Mm.
is it's body language along with the facial expressions, but it's also energy that you pick up and things that are just in the ether that are hard for us to explain. But we do tend to be able to read those things more quickly and more easily than other people whose brains are not as highly attuned to those kinds of stimuli.
Oh,
So
it's so fascinating.
yeah, it really is. That was something I researched for the book because I really wanted to understand where it came from. And it's not an area that there's been a lot of research done on. Um, I think we need a lot more. There is at least one researcher who I know of who is doing research. She is a highly sensitive person, and she does research on intuition.
Oh,
And it's just a fascinating, fascinating area.
yes. And I wonder if on that particular point, again, it's kind of overlapped here with my own personal experience. But I know with me, for lots of different reasons, intuition and gut instinct was something I think I always had at a young age. But I think I lost the connection as I grew up, probably because of what everybody was telling me. And again, not with any malice, just, because of societal norms and so forth. But I think it was one of those things, and it wasn't until I started my business and people were saying, "But what's your gut instinct saying?" And I was like, I have no idea what you are talking about. And I just wonder if that was something you saw as well, or that's just me.
It is so not just you. I have seen that very much in my own life. And I think it is true for a lot of, not I think, I know it's true for a lot of the people I've spoken with. So our society is very much evidence based. Everything has to be based on the data. I laugh because I was raised in a family of lawyers. So, if anything could be more like lawyers and scientists, how could
Yeah.
you be more fact based, right? Interestingly, most of those lawyers are also creatives. So, among those, there are lots of artists and photographers and writers, but they're still very much trained to focus on the evidence, on the data, on the facts. And children, before we have that societal, before we're educated in schools and before we have that societal, you must have the evidence for this.
Hmm.
I think we're all very intuitive. One of the research studies that I came across, or one of the experts I came across, said intuition, like I mentioned with empathy before, is a muscle that we need to flex. It's something that we need to practice and build. So we all have it to start out. Society kind of beats it out of us, and we have to come back to it ourselves of our own accord. One of the things that I talk a lot about in the book is how important it is for us, especially for those of us who are highly perceptive, to listen to our intuition and listen to our gut feeling, and how wrongly we can steer ourselves when we don't. And I give some examples of big life decisions that I made that I went with my head and not my
Hmm.
heart or my gut,
Hmm.
and I regretted it. And I don't do that anymore because I know that I can't always prove how I know something. I can't always, give you facts or evidence for why I know something. But when I know it, far more often than not, it turns out to be accurate.
Hmm.
And I think that is a gift that we need to nurture and treasure because it really is a superpower.
It is, yes. And I think even though for a lot of us it gets beaten out of us as we're getting older, I think again with that normalization that a lot of us have when we're highly sensitive, and we don't even see the gifts because we just assume they're normal and they're just part of being human. I know that if I looked at my life, even though I would say logically I have no idea what my gut instinct and intuition is saying, when I look at some of the decisions I've made, I went, I don't actually know why I made that decision. It just felt right. Like moving to
Mhm.
this house, I remember really pushing this. I go, no, that's going to be a good move. It's a really good thing for us to do.
Mhm.
Whereas my husband had to have like a for and against list. and he is very slow at making decisions. And I think that's just interesting. Sometimes I need that balance, but I generally make quite quick decisions, and I wouldn't necessarily know I always know why. So it was always there. I just didn't know or appreciate the fact that it was there. So I just wonder if that, I'd love to hear from the audience if that feels the same for them as well, whether they've actually not really lost that connection at all. They've just not realized what it was.
I think there are lots of different variations of this. I agree with you. I would love to hear from your listeners. I think it's different for everyone. I know that with some decisions, it can be very quick for me, and I just know immediately which choice is the right one. There are other times when I still need to make those pros and cons
Mm.
lists. I don't always pay attention to the list. I might do it just to feel like, okay, now I've done it. Now I can go and make the decision I really want to make. So maybe that's just me wasting my own time or procrastinating. I'm not sure. But I do think, I think we're coming to a time where some of these older gifts, and I'm calling it an older gift because it's something that's been
Mm.
around since the beginning of time, are starting to be more appreciated again
Yeah.
and starting to be more accepted again. And so many of us have still been masking for most of our lives.
Hmm.
And by masking, I mean hiding who we naturally are. It's something that many, many, many highly perceptive folks do without realizing they're doing it. It's not something we do intentionally.
Mm.
But from a very early age, we realize that we are a little bit different and that some of the ways in which we're different are not necessarily accepted. And we observe, we watch, and we notice what society says is okay and what society says is not okay. And because we're so perceptive, we take in those, whether it's mannerisms or ways of being, we put on a persona often to become a little bit more of what
Mm.
is acceptable. Not everybody does this, and there are definitely a lot of creative people who have always done creative things don't do this. And they're always considered a little bit more on the fringe of society. But for example, with the women that I work with, who are mostly in the corporate world, they learned early on that I'll give you an example. I remember saying to my mother, who was both an artist and an attorney and a number of other
I love
things,
it.
um, when I was about, I don't know, 12, 14 years old, something like that, I never want to work in an office when I grow up. Now, she laughed at me and basically said, you're very naive, and when you grow up, you'll realize that that was a ridiculous thing to say. I didn't have the language at that age to articulate what I really wanted to communicate, which was I don't see myself as a corporate 9 to 5 person who wears a suit and goes into an office every
Hmm.
day. I didn't mean I would never be in a place that was an office of any kind.
Yeah.
But interestingly, I have never worked in a workplace that required formal attire or required a suit or required anything like that. If I couldn't wear jeans, I didn't want to work there.
Hmm.
And so I knew that I needed to express parts of myself. Think there were things that were important to me, but I also got all the messages that you can't make a living that way.
Mm.
And, you need to just sort of be like everybody else to fit in and to, have a career. So, and that's not uncommon. I would say that's probably more common for those of us who are highly perceptive than not.
Hmm.
And so we develop this mask, this persona. And one of the things that suffers is our natural intuition.
Yes. Oh, that's so beautifully said. And again, my brain is firing up. You know, when you start to talk and you start to look back, I'm sure the listeners are doing exactly the same thing when they start to look back at their life. Yes, I can completely and utterly resonate with so much with what you're saying. I just think it's fascinating that we do. And when I think of my own mask, and I think sometimes the understanding is that it then becomes people pleasing And this is how my head's sort of going into that direction. But I think when you strip it back to the bare necessities, it's not necessarily people pleasing. It came from a place of, this is okay for me to be and this is not okay for me to be. So I have to make myself this thing to be able to be accepted. If that does that make sense? Just that, yeah.
It completely makes sense. And when you say you're looking back over your life, this is what happened to me as I was writing the book, as I was researching and talking with more people and learning. I started looking back over my own life and the patterns and starting to see. It's interesting. I was on a podcast last year with a host named Amy Ballantyne, and the podcast is called Power to the People Pleasers. And the first question that she asks every guest is, in your life, have you been a people pleaser? And if so, how did it show up? And my first reaction to that question was, no, I really haven't been, because I've always been pretty independent and, said what
Hmm.
I wanted. And as I was writing the book, and I even talked about this in the book, I started thinking about more examples that could be considered people pleasing, because it was not necessarily doing things to make others happy, but it was doing things to make myself stand out less
Mm.
and to accommodate a standard that was something that wasn't mine, you
Hmm.
know, expectations that other people had set. I think that's something that a lot of us do.
I do, yeah. And as you were saying that, I was like, isn't it interesting? Because I do think there's, again, two sides to this coin. I think a lot of highly sensitives are, probably stubborn is the wrong word, but very grounded in what they believe. And they have a very kind of definitive idea of, this is what I believe, and I do not believe this. I do see that. And then this flip side of, but I still have to be this way in order to fit in, to make myself a little bit smaller. And I just think it's so interesting. I'm thinking of like school, and my son is 15 at the moment. He's highly sensitive, and he is a self-proclaimed nerd. That's what he calls himself. But he loves that. And he has no intention of trying to be somebody he's not at school. He's very clear. This is who I am. This is what I believe in, and I'm not going to be dragged down. But he still has people pleasing tendencies that come out in different ways. It's just so interesting as you're saying that. It can be both, can't it? It can be that and rather than that or.
It absolutely can be. And I love that your son is proud of who he is and has, owns his identity.
Mm.
I think there's a lot of generational issues in here, because I think the world has become a lot more welcoming of difference. I say this given the insanity that's going on with the United States right now
Yes.
and other parts of the world, particularly in the United States, but other parts of the world too, that is really, really not welcoming of difference. But in general, I think we know that generations that are coming of age now are more willing to claim gender fluidity and non-binary-ness. I'm not sure that's a word, but you know what I mean. And neurodivergence,
Hmm.
and they're less willing to adapt themselves to societal standards, which
Hmm.
is amazing. I think those of us who are a little bit older didn't have as much exposure to that
Hmm.
and didn't feel that we had those choices. And so when you say that we've always felt strongly about what we believe, but we've had to adapt a lot of us have had to adapt in various ways. I know when I was in my 20s, for example, I was really into metaphysical
Mm.
interests. So astrology and tarot cards and other things that some people consider paranormal, some people, but metaphysical things. I really was fascinated by them, and they drew me. And then in my 30s, I realized things were not working for me the way that I really wanted them to. I wasn't achieving the success that I wanted to professionally. And again, whose definition of success was that? I
Yeah.
don't think it was actually mine, but from a societal perspective, I wasn't. getting where I needed to be. And I now, looking back, call my 30s my lost decade because
Mm.
I really just kind of sublimated my personality. I was living in a place that I wasn't happy in. I was working in jobs that I wasn't happy in. I was doing what I thought I was supposed to do. In my 40s, I started to recover from that.
Yes.
And now in my 50s, I would say I am much more myself than I have ever been since, as an adult,
Mhm.
and am kind of reclaiming all that is me and can be proud of it and proud of who I am. So I love that your son can be who he is and is happy with it. And the people-pleasing tendencies, as long as they're not actively harming him, are what he needs to do for now. And at
Mhm.
some point, maybe he'll grow out of them, maybe he won't. We'll see. I love that he's proud of being a nerd and has
Yes.
found a place.
He loves it. It's just interesting having a highly sensitive son, and it was my dad who was highly sensitive as well. So it's just interesting seeing it go through. And I think there are some learned habits that I learned from my dad. My dad was a silent generation, which I always think is fascinating, because he was born in 1945. So he
Hmm.
was just put your head down, put your head down. You don't talk, you don't say anything. And him being highly sensitive as well just gave it that edge. So there are learnt behaviours that I have that I've kind of had to unpick and unlearn, and I'm
Hmm.
very aware of what I'm or how I'm behaving around Jake as well, because I don't want him to take those forward as
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is fascinating. It's
I said to my husband, I went, really thinking about doing a master's or a PhD, just to go back and just to be able to do research. I
I
just would find it
yes.
fascinating.
I totally agree with you. I don't need the credentials of it,
No.
but just to immerse
Mm.
myself in the research. That was what was so much fun about the book, and frustrating and fun, but it was I really, really enjoyed doing it and learned amazing things.
Well, we've already said it's in my basket ready to purchase after. So how can people find it? How can they find out more about you? Just, yeah, let us know.
Sure. So people can find me generally in one of two places. I'm on LinkedIn as Rachel Radway, and there aren't very many Rachel Radways in the world, so you should be able to find me easily. And I am also on the web at rercoaching.com. So my initials are rercoaching.com. And you can find the book Perceptive on the website at rercoaching.com/book. And you can also find it on Amazon, at barnesandnoble.com, and at bookshelf.org. I don't
Yes,
know if, okay,
it
so
is. Yeah, there is a
it is
British
international.
version.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So all of those places you can find it.
Yes, and I will make sure that we put the link in the show notes. I'll, I think what I might do is try and find the Amazon US one as well as the UK one, and then
Okay.
your website one as well, so that people just cater for
I can send
everybody.
those to you. Sure, I can send those to you.
Perfect. Thank you. That would be amazing. And thank you so, 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 so much. It's been a fascinating conversation, and it's made me want to go and read the research. There was a book that you mentioned earlier as well that I would love to put into the show notes. What was that book called
Sure.
again?
So it's called I can send you that link as well. It's called The Brain of the Highly Sensitive Person by Esther Bergsma.
Okay. That would be amazing because I would like to give that a read, and I've not read that one.
Esther's great, and she's one of the people that I talked to. She's in the book as well
Oh,
in Perceptive.
fantastic.
I definitely make references to her book in there, but I also interviewed her, and we've had several conversations since then.
Oh, lovely. Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so, so much. Oh, this has been such a food for thought, and I really hope that the listeners can take away so much and that they get to think about their own kind of journey being highly sensitive and how that's really presented itself for them. And I would love, love, love for you to go and buy the book, give it a read, and then make sure you go and review it as well and give Rachel an amazing review to go along with it. So thank you so much. Is there anything you want to add before we kind of wrap up?
First, I just want to thank you for having me on. It's been such a lovely conversation, and I feel like, as I said, we could go on for ages and ages. And I also just want to say, to your listeners, because I assume they are probably all highly sensitive
Mm.
and highly perceptive, focus on your gifts because you have so many of them. And sometimes our families, our teachers, our colleagues, our bosses try to drum them out of us or give us the messages that they are false. They're not. They're just part of who we are, but we have amazing gifts that not everyone has and that really serve the world. And there are reasons why we have them, and give yourself some grace because we're not always very good at doing that.
No. Oh, that's choked me up a little bit there. I do think that's a huge part of the reason that I do what I do, is because I think we need more sensitive people in the world making the decisions, to be quite frank. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Agree.
Thank you so much for being a guest. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. And guys, I will be back next time with another episode. Thank you so much. See you soon. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to this week's podcast with me, Kate Carter. I appreciate you so much. If you enjoyed this show, then please leave a review. Every month I will pick a winner for a free 50-minute coaching session with me. Also, if you know someone who could benefit from listening to this podcast, then please share and help me reach more new entrepreneurs who could benefit from learning their own small steps to take.